2020 has proven to be a very difficult time thanks to COVID-19, but in spite of this insidious disease, it is very pleasing to be able to report to everybody that Rotary is alive and well. Our club has been meeting via Zoom over the last 6 months, and members have become quite used to that technology. Tonight, we're further embracing that technology by having this evening's program delivered by Zoom webinar. And as I said before, while you can see and hear the speakers, they cannot see and hear you, unlike normal Zoom meetings. As our fundraising director, Carolyn Such, has pointed out, tonight's webinar is our major fundraising effort for this first 6 months of the Rotary year. So thank you everybody for attending, and thank you so much for your $25 contribution in paying. Carolyn will have more to say about that later in the evening, but it does mean that this will be a very successful first half-year fundraiser. I would now like to introduce this evening's guest speaker, Timothy Robert Wilson, born in 1980, and I've got to tell you, when you're my age, that really puts a shiver down your spine, is the member for Goldstein in the Federal Parliament. First elected in 2016 and re-elected in 2019. Tim is chair of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Economics. As Sue, our president, said, previously he served as Australia's Human Rights Commissioner from 2014 to 2016. With very strong views on a broad range of issues, including the influence of China, the growing influence of China, taxation policy, effective financial management, marriage equality, and a host of other issues, Tim is often in the media. Tonight he will speak with us on his recent publication, The New Social Contract, and in that context, Australia's Future. Now, I've had the opportunity to read the book, and it's quite deep in part, but it is easily read and understood. Tim is both passionate and courageous as he puts forward reasoned arguments in promotion of small L liberalism and paints a way forward for Australia. While I'm sure that not everybody, including some of his conservative colleagues, would accept everything that he writes, most would accept that Tim puts forward his arguments in a manner that clearly articulates his views. In the book, one particular quote, and there's lots of quotes and it's well worth reading, and I commend it to you, but one particular quote in the book caught my attention, and I will read it out. One of the most basic rules of success in politics is that voters have to be able to see how their lives are lived through the values you project. I think this is a basic tenet of good politics, and in my view, Tim's book could be something of a Bible for those who might be seeking a career in politics. Please join with me in welcoming to Tim. Over to you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and to everybody who is on the call. I don't know how many of you there are, but thank you to all that are attending, and I hope you've chipped in your $25, and I'm happy to chip in my $25 as well, don't worry, because Rotary is a good cause. I've spoken at many a Rotary meeting in my own electorate of Goldstein, and of course across the country in all of my capacities, the IPA, Human Rights Commissioner, and a Member of Parliament. And one of the challenges that's come as a consequence of COVID-19, one of the many challenges has been a lot of community-based organisations have, of course, struggled to fundraise and to keep their activity going strong. And I'm very aware of that. And so that's why I'm more than happy to chip in the $25 if it helps. And also donate a book for a raffle if anybody, if Mornington Rotary would be happy to take one as well. To try and talk about Australia's future is immensely challenging because it depends on when you want to look at the snapshot of the time frame that we're looking at. And critically, what I have done in the book, The New Social Contract, and I say this not to draw reference to it because I want people to buy it, though I'll always, of course, encourage people to do so, is because we're at the end of an era. And one of my more prescient friends said at the start of this year, the 21st century begun. And I agree with that sentiment because what we've come out of is the end of the 20th century and the legacy particularly up until about 2010, of course, at the end of the Cold War, and really the geopolitical environment that Australia and the global community operated in for a very long time, particularly as a consequence of the Second World War. And there were ideas and values that underpinned the structures of our society, of governance, that are now up for significant challenges. And the point of the new social contract is to revisit and to discuss, well, what does it mean to be a liberal democracy in a modern Australia? And I say that because I think it's critically important we look at these issues through the lens of a social contract. Now, probably to address that first, I have to discuss what I mean by a social contract, which is, it's often been discussed by great political philosophers like Edmund Burke and, of course, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, about the idea of a social contract. And they all have their different interpretations, but they have one common thread. The common thread of the social contract is essentially the pact or the bargain that rests between citizens and their governments, and the basis in which governments seek legitimacy for their purpose. So what is the legitimacy of a government at any given time? And it changes dramatically depending on the circumstances in which we live. In his 5-part volume history of Australian liberalism, which is quite extensive, one of my predecessors, Dr. David Kemp, talks about when European settlers arrived, there was a social contract between the new arrivals, whether they be convicts or free settlers, around creating a nation for people, or a new nation for people, or colonies, I should say, more correctly at that time, that was about creating a free society essentially from scratch. It was leaving behind the legacy of hereditary privilege that exists in the United Kingdom. We didn't inherit some of the revolutionary fire from the United States and the tensions. They were to create a new and free society. And at the time, there were lots of political debates in Europe about what that meant. Now, I just want to stress, I understand that that came very much at the expense of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but that was the underpinnings, the values-based approach that led to the development of the new society. In fact, when Wentworth was governor of New South Wales, he pushed for the idea of introducing hereditary privilege through the creation of what we call the Bunyip aristocracy. And that faced significant pushback from the new colonials. And the foundations of the Australian social contract has basically been that the role of government is to create the structures for a free society that empowers individuals to be able to live out the best of their lives at the time. And that's gone through different iterations. After Federation, we had a discussion around what we needed to do with protectionism and the White Australia policy and the development of industry domestically. After the Second World War in particular, Menzies looked at, there's a real tension around the idea of a social contract and particularly what those who came back from the war could expect and what their aspirations and hopes were. There was a big divide then between Ben Chifley and Sir Robert Menzies about a society anchored in home ownership. Chifley was in favour of creating a national renters class. Menzies was in favour of a nation built from home ownership, and obviously Menzies went on to win that argument. But as we got towards the end of the 20th century, there was a recognition there was inefficiency from things like protectionism, which had pervaded most of the latter part of the 20th century. And so really from the end of the Cold War till about 2010, the focus was on what we commonly call these days neoliberal ideas, which is about extracting the equity within the economy and society to make it more competitive. And so there's always been this shift, an attitudinal shift. And what the new social contract, or what I write the new social contract is to point out where the real divides in 21st century Australia, at least for the next 10 to 20 years, are presented. Now, I say this because they existed before COVID-19, but what's happened because of COVID-19 is all of those issues have been brought forward and dramatically. Because if you go around the Western liberal democracies today, and I'm saying this analytically, not in a partisan sense, good or negative, just analytically, the primary divider in voter behaviour today, and therefore what people see as the issues, what they want to see their government achieve, and where that government is seen to be working for the people that they're there to serve, is age. Once upon a time, it was people's social status, or it was people's level of education, employment, or wealth. And what's become a snapshot in Western liberal democracies right now is that societies, more than anything else, are divided by age. And that is not to stoke that, it is just to recognise that. So much so that in the United Kingdom, it's now been identified as the single biggest determinant of people's voting behaviour. We're seeing exactly the same thing in the United States. In the United States, following the global financial crisis, young people felt they were being left behind by their political systems. So what did they do? They went off and voted not just for the US Democrats in huge numbers and proportionate to their traditional voting base, but they voted not just for the US Democrats, they went off and voted for the most left-wing version of the US Democrats. By comparison, exactly the opposite thing has been happening with older people in those countries. For every time the number of young people increasing to vote for the British Labour Party, you're seeing increases in the concentration of older Britons going to vote for the Conservatives. The same is true in America, Democrats versus Republicans. And the same thing is actually happening in Australia as well. And this has been sort of largely undetected part of the political discussion in this country. And to give you a cold hard fact, which obviously disturbs me, but will have a big impact on different people's perspectives on the call, is that in the 2004 federal election, for somebody under the age of 35, they were 48% likely to vote for the Liberal or National parties. So basically nearly 50%. Today, it is 23% for under 35s. And the exact opposite is happening at the other end, and you go to the last election and an issue which I had a lot to do with, of course, around refundable franking credits or the retiree tax, depending how you want to present it, and what was the primary issue or divider amongst voters, and it was that issue, and of course it largely favoured those who were self-funded retirees. So we're seeing a divide in society based on age. Now, I'm not the first person to identify it. People like Bernard Salt, the demographer, have identified this and written extensively about it. But it's a much bigger impact in terms of the sustainability of our society. And that's what the new social contract talks about the fundamental problems of what it means to be a just society, so that you have systems of governance that have what we normally use in terms of discussions around government, around social license. Sorry, normally around business, we say, what is their social license? Increasingly, this is becoming a big problem for governments as well, because most people approach politics based on their stages of life. Young people want to get opportunity. They want the opportunity to get a good education, a good job, to be able to go off and buy their own home and have a family. And not unreasonably, as people move towards the latter stages of their life, they become more conscious of issues of security, securing the investments they've made or the effort or the reward for effort they've got from their work, whether that's in their owning their own home, and increasingly with health and aged care, because of course people are living longer with more conditions, and of course are more vulnerable as a consequence as they get towards the latter stages of life. But one thing leads people to shift their voting sentiment and behaviour around the different stages of their life. And that is principally comes down to one thing, which is home ownership, because that is the catalyst at which the opportunity stage of life shifts, where people used to want to invest in their opportunity and then have something fundamentally to conserve. Marriage and family are also a big part of that, but home ownership is the full materialization of independence. And what we're seeing now is a lot of younger people who now, as a consequence of COVID-19, are losing their employment. Therefore, they're going to be in a less position to be able to do things for their own home and, of course, to settle down, have a family, and therefore political issues. Now, some people who are on the left of the political spectrum probably think that's fantastic, but I would argue that it will lead to a very imbalanced society, because what you'll end up having is people who have no investment in the status quo. And this is one of the great lessons of the French Revolution, when you had peasants who had no investment in the status quo and all the benefits were going away from them and towards those in hereditary positions and the aristocracy. they had nothing to stop them revolting and trying to overthrow the existing structures of society. And the concern I have, or what I raised in the new social contract, is that we are heading in that direction. Now, that might seem extreme, but when you look at what's happening overseas with young people and their voting behaviour, they're not shifting left or they're shifting left, which I'm not arguing against because I know Rotary is non-partisan, but they're going to the more extreme ends of that. So you're getting more and more semi-revolutionary, at least through the ballot box behaviour and the restructuring of society. So if you want a continuation of a society where people have an investment, where they want to conserve the status quo, where they want a society that's working for them, it needs to work for them. And that's what is not happening. And what I make predictions in the new social contract is that a lot of these problems are going to evolve over the next decade. They're already here, but they're going to continue to evolve over the next decade, and they're going to hit essentially a political crisis for our country by about 2030. Now, I published the book in July of this year. It was finished in May. COVID-19 had hit, and I made the prediction that we were going to have a health crisis, but that will lead to a political crisis. And that political crisis is the only reason that we haven't seen even more radical behaviour amongst young Australians, because we never really had a significant downturn as a consequence of the global financial crisis. And if the COVID-19 economic crisis turns out as concerning as I believe it could and would, and unfortunately I'm afraid to say I suspect will, then we will start to see this increasingly revolutionary behaviour where young people finish university saddled with debt. Now in Australia, that's much more manageable than many other countries, but it'll still stop you doing things like buying your own home. If you're in an environment where you can't get a job, saddled with debt, can't get a job, and then not able to essentially progress through what most of us would call as the natural stages of life, you'll find people increasingly feeling like the society and the political system is not working for them. And they have no investment in the status quo, so they'll have an incentive to change their behaviour or to change the structures of society itself. And this is very worrying. I don't think it's a good thing. We're a liberal democracy founded on the principles of creating a society that empowers people. So what do we need to do to get back to that, where people are realising their aspirations to be able to live out their lives? And I draw particularly two very critical issues. One is around home ownership, and it's across the board. The solution is not to make it easier for young people simply to get into the existing home market, because it means they're buying property at inflated prices, which is not helpful. In 1980, it cost 4 times the average income of the Australian to buy your own home. Today, it's around 9% in most of the country, and in places like Sydney and Melbourne, often around 11 or 12%. So there's an extreme growth. And I know some people say we pay higher interest rates. Well, that is true. But because of the increase even with low interest rates now, because of the volume of debt young people having to take on, it's making it harder for them to save for their deposit, which is obviously the entree point. But then it's only equivalent to having essentially 17% interest rates. So that's how dire the situation is for housing affordability for young Australians. There are lots of other factors, supply and planning regulation, that we have to confront. And the other significant one is actually monetary policy. Now, some of the self-funded retirees on this call will probably like what I'm about to say, is I think we need higher interest rates. And I say that because it keeps downward pressure on property prices. It obviously helps those who want to make savings. But one of the things that's happened over the past 30 years is we've shifted from essentially local prices for consumer products, and we've shifted to global prices. So the price of an iPhone is the same as Australia as it is the UK or the US or anywhere else. So what's been happening over particularly the past decade is governments have been pumping more and more money into our economic system, and it hasn't been able to inflate prices. And I'm not an inflation fan. I'm very much hostile to inflation. So what's happened is inflation has only been able to occur in immovable assets, essentially things that can't really be traded across international borders. So when you get people like Alan Kohler, who goes on the ABC and in my view, sells a con of what's called modern monetary theory, which is the idea that basically the Reserve Bank can just print cash into the economy, put it into the economy, and because we haven't had any inflation as a consequence of quantitative easing after the global financial crisis, it's all built on a lie. There has been inflation, but it's been inflation in immovable assets, principally housing. So it's making the rich richer, it's making young people poorer, and it means that new migrants into a society are set further back and are less likely to politically integrate, or socially, economically, and politically integrate. None of those things are good. But what it's ultimately amounting to is a wealth transfer from the young to the established and the rich. Now, I'm a liberal, as you know, and I say that in the classical sense. I'm not a socialist, so some of these things might sound heretical to some people or might find it challenging, but this is a really big problem for our society because the traditional family relationship or transfer of wealth is down generations. What governments are now doing around the world is turning around the flow of the river and actually entrenching the privilege and the interests of older people. And that is not sustainable politically. It is not just in a society. Older people, of course, should have their effort and their labour respected, and they should be able to age with dignity, and I'm not arguing to take things off them. But what a lot of the things, particularly around areas like tax do, and I go to this extent to full extent in the book, is essentially we tax earnings and growth from capital at a much more preferential rate than we do income. You just need to look at the company tax rate, which is obviously off the back of investments, versus the marginal tax rates that people pay as workers. And we give preferential arrangement to capital, which means you have to have capital, which means you're either rich or you're an established interest, or you're likely to be older because most people hold their wealth in their family home or their superannuation fund. So we're shifting the flow of the nation's income up and, of course, making it harder while putting further burdens, particularly in income tax, on younger Australians. This is not unique to us. The same trends are emerging, as I said, not just politically, but in terms of policy in the US. It's a direct legacy, obviously, of having a very large section of the population in baby boomers. And exactly the same thing is happening in the UK. David Willits, who's a former Tory MP, wrote a book which is much more provocative than mine, called The Pinch: Why the Baby Boomers Stole Younger Britain's Future and Why They Should Give It Back. Now, I'm not saying that at all, but I am saying that we need to revisit some of these issues now because they're critically important if we want to take society forward together. And that is the foundations of the Australian social contract. It's not just that we want to empower every person to be able to go out and live their lives, but the great success of our country is that we have progressively moved in taking people forward together. And they understand and respect the fact that if you work hard and you put in the initiative, that you deserve reward. And that where people can't do so, that we give them the assistance they need. But when you have structures of government and society that provide preference and benefits to established interest, it doesn't do that. In fact, as I said before, it reverses the flow of the river. And we've got to be very conscious and very aware of that. It's not the only divide that exists in society. There are many other people have written books like David Goodhart in the United Kingdom around the anywheres and somewheres, which is about those people who live in the international global economy versus those who live in jobs that are anchored in a domestic economy. But in each one of the cases, it's quite clear that there are divides within society that need to be addressed so that a society can move forward together. And these challenges are only going to become much greater and much more difficult to confront. We sit now in a region, of course, which is highly volatile, and Australia is right at the fore of those political discussions around geopolitical strategic concerns and regional stability. And so there's going to be huge demands in every direction on government policy, to try and take the country forward while making sure that we take everybody forward together. I'll leave my remarks there and very much welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Tim. And we do have a number of questions in already. Just before we hand over to you for the first question, if I can just remind people, there is a Q&A button on your computer or device. So if you type in your question, and it will then be relayed to Tim. The first one you touched on the way through, and I think it's probably from someone looking for, I'm not going to read out the names of everybody because there are some that are similar questions have come in from more than one person, but I think it's someone who's probably looking for a little bit of hope or optimism for the future. Government has treated the pandemic as being very serious. But what can we hope for now over the next 12 months to 2 years, both from a health point of view and also, importantly, economically? And I know that you touched on that on part, but that might be a bit of a Dorothy Dixer to start with.
Yeah, it is a bit of a Dorothy Dixer. And of course, one thing I forgot to do at the start was, of course, acknowledge my mother, Linda, and acknowledge that she's watching tonight. So so part of the challenge we face economically, I feel like I should be very cautious about what I talk about in the health space. I think either this Rotary Club or another one has had the health minister. Actually, I think it was one of mine. Brighton Rotary had the health minister recently, and where there's obviously a focus on what we need to do in terms of vaccines and the opportunities that exist there. But I don't feel sufficiently expert in commenting on that. Beyond the fact that I'm very cautious about the strategies that particularly the state governments are invoking, and this is not a partisan reflection. It's an honest reality that every pathway around trying to constrain COVID-19 comes with inevitable risk. And if you take the approach that you need to bet everything on black on a vaccine, which is in part what a lot of countries are doing, I don't think you're taking a strategic or managed risk approach. And that one of the great follies of particularly the Victorian situation is that the government has started from a principle basis where they believe that they should shut everything down or lock everything down and then make judgment calls about what they allow to open. And that compares very dramatically to what's happening in New South Wales, and our situations are different, but where they start assuming everything's open and then target what they believe needs to close to protect public health. And depending on which direction you go, and will have a dramatic effect then flow on to the economy and the capacity for people to get jobs. But I don't want to give people inflated expectations that everything is going to be rosy and peachy, because so much of our economy as a country, particularly Victoria, has been widely discussed, is dependent heavily on people movement as part of the services economy, university education, tourism, and the like. Some of the positive data we've seen recently has been because Australians can't travel, and because Australians can't travel, who are generally spending more overseas than they do domestically, that money is coming back into our country and boosting some of the domestic tourism sector. But one of the problems we're going to have is with increasing official unemployment, the number of people with that discretionary spending and, of course, confidence is likely to also remain fragile. And we're already seeing in the Northern Hemisphere, they're going through their second wave. We're really going through our first wave of the virus, and that will be instructive for based on what we can prepare ourselves for next year should we see another border breach. But I would also stress that internationally, a lot of countries went into this crisis economically in a much, much, much weaker position than us. And as a consequence, the amount of money they've been able to spend on propping up their economies is much more constrained and exhausted. And I'm still we really haven't seen the global economic shock that's come as a consequence of this crisis, which rightly or wrongly, I expect will probably come in the coming months, which could then kick off some quite disruptive economic behaviour next year, particularly around employment, which of course could then have an impact on property prices. So it's hard to see, because normally when you draw a roadmap of where you are and where you want to get to, you need to know where you're starting from. And one of the biggest problems that every government has at the moment, as well as anyone who's trying to make investments on their share portfolio, predictions on their superannuation, is that we don't know, as a global economy, let alone a local economy, where we are starting from. What we do know is that because we were relatively prudent and I say relatively prudent in the lead up to this crisis, we at least have started roughly from a position of strength, which has meant that we've been able to do more to protect the community and the country's economy.
Thanks, Tim. Look, I just had a little bit of feedback from someone saying, why am I on the screen? Can I recommend to people that they hit speaker view and then Tim takes up the vast bulk up on the on most computers up at the top there's a thing called gallery view, speaker view. If you hit that, you'll get Tim taking up the large part of your screen. A number of questions on China, concern about Belt and Road, and in particular how you might see our relationship with China, keeping in mind Taiwan, and how would Australia react? And I know you've got to be very careful here, and we're not going to apply the Chatham House rule or anything like that, but how would we react and how would we stand if China decided to try and take Taiwan back?
So in the federal parliament, I'm part of a group who are one of the founding members of a group who's particularly critical of the Chinese Communist Party. So there's virtually nothing I could say that would be any more inflammatory than I've already said. That's the luxury of being a backbencher. But particularly on Taiwan, the short answer is Australia has no retaliatory capacity against the Chinese Communist Party if they were to make an aggressive approach towards Taiwan in isolation. It would have to be as part of, obviously, a discussion with the United States. And one of the challenges we've all had in this space with Donald Trump is it's been opaque about how he would respond. And it's not totally clear, of course, who the next US president will be and how they might respond to such a potential threat. But even then, it wouldn't just be about the United States. I mean, this is the most interesting time in Australian foreign policy, in my view, that will have probably existed in the country. And that isn't to diminish significant periods in the past. But there's been a huge strategic shift as a consequence of the withdrawal of the United States' involvement internationally, and particularly in our region. Other countries who are, of course, quite intimidated by China because of their size and have felt one of the key things about a lot of countries, whether it's Malaysia or Thailand or Vietnam or Japan or South Korea or anyone else, is that they've relied on the United States as a, for one of the better phrase, honest partner between them all, because, of course, all these countries have their own history amongst themselves and towards China as well. And we have had to fill much of that void. And in fact, between us and the Japan have both on the trade side and on the geopolitical side, and increasingly on the military side, had to find ways to cooperate and then bring together other countries to stand up against China. And this is one of the things that I think people, we often misunderstand, whether it's the United States or us, is we think of it through the lens of us versus China or the United States versus China. And that's just not the reality. It's almost everybody except Cambodia standing up for their national sovereignty to be able to exist in a region of peace and stability where we respect each other's borders and our rights to coexist. And we're in a particularly unique position because what's happened, particularly under the current Prime Minister, is quite a significant policy shift, where we've become very robust in standing up for what we deem to be our national interest. And a lot of people have become quite shaky about that because they've said, well, there's obviously going to be trade impacts. And they're right. We're going to have to make tough realpolitik. There are going to be consequences. The sort of liberal internationalist world of the late 20th century, where everybody just focused on getting along, broadly speaking, and trading amongst each other, is over. It's a time for tough choices and tough consequences. And what we're doing as a country is standing up and getting other countries to stand up too. The task is going to be, or the scale of the task about how we're going to respond is largely dependent then on whether we can rely on the United States and their obviously might, or whether we're going to have to do it as part of countries like India, Japan and Singapore, where we don't necessarily have the same military power, and so it's going to have to be done geopolitically and strategically instead.
Thanks, Tim. One that's come in now on Davos. It's been mooted that the next meeting of international leaders at Davos shall be focusing discussion around the topic of the Great Reset. Given that the meeting will be under the shadow of COVID, is a Great Reset inevitable in the short term? If it is, how will it evidence itself in the political and economic environments?
Well, there's already a Great Reset. The reset has happened where we've gone back to a world where countries think very much about their national interest. Supply chains have been disrupted, or certainly there's been a greater concern about supply chains. If you think about most products outside of raw materials, they're made across countries. And of course, particularly with China, countries have become a lot more nervous about sending products through such a significant single point in the world. So we've seen a reset on that front. And of course, this is really going to be, I suspect, I don't know the time frame, but definitely security decade and potentially security 30 or 40 years, where security has gone to the fore of people's mind. Health security obviously demonstrated by the pandemic, national security demonstrated by the potential military threat of some countries in the world, particularly those who might be more interested in expanding their influence, both through supply chains, as China is seeking to do through the Belt and Road Initiative, or their own military build-up. So it's a very tense time. And so that reset is already going to happen. And part of it is how we all as a world going to get along to make sure we do things like avoid conflict, recognise countries' capacity to develop, but also some of the bigger problems around countries' capacities to be able to stand up to for themselves. And this is critically important because, of course, when you've got a country like the United States, who in broad principle has not sought to be imperial and expand its influence and power, we've been able to maintain a level of stability. Now, I know people will argue there were different conflicts they got involved with they shouldn't have, but they haven't sought to increase their physical footprint on the world beyond their own ultimate defence. Whereas what we're seeing, particularly through the Belt and Road Initiative with China, is them increasing the extent of their footprint for their own security to basically turn much of the world into guaranteeing the supply that China needs for its own people. And that, of course, comes with pretty significant consequences around the potential risks of military expansion that make many of us very nervous.
There's a number of questions coming in, so we'll probably try and get moving fairly quickly. This one's a fairly long one, but as a father of two young sons, 7 and 5, I know what is best for them over the long term. And that may require telling them some truths that may upset them in the short term, but will ultimately make them better people. What I see from our leaders, politicians from all sides in recent years, decades, is the refusal to make adult decisions and pretend government can protect everyone from everything bad in the world and wrap them up in cotton wool. They lead by opinion polls and short-term ease rather than doing what is best for our country and citizens over the long term. Is this the inevitability of democracy? And will it continue to get worse? Or is this a cycle that will swing back to real leadership in due time? And what will it take to make this happen? Did you get that one, Tim?
So the person who asked it, I really like it. Whoever asked that question, I really like it. It's a great question. It's a cycle. It's a cycle as a consequence of our prosperity and the relative peace and stability in the world, where people haven't faced common threats and perhaps have become more insular in their thinking. I mean, the reality is the past 30 years for people in Australia has by and large been pretty good, and we haven't had external threats, and we've had the capacity to cushion people from what is unfortunately sometimes the more difficult realities of life. And the reality is times are going to compel us to stand up if you want to be a successful country around driving economic reform, around what's necessary to secure our sovereignty and our national interests. And I would stress that sometimes we have had those hard discussions because leaders have been prepared to confront the population on some of those issues. But I understand the concern, and I think we are heading back to a time where real leadership is going to be clearer. But I mean, one of the points, and it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is that sometimes you have to turn up to audiences and tell people what they don't want to hear. And sometimes you have to turn up and show them the data and the evidence to show that there are structural problems that you have to confront. Now, I'm doing it on issues of tax and the economy, but if you don't tell people the truth, then they won't understand the nature of the problem, why it then must be adjusted, and then take people into your confidence then on a basis of trust about how you're going to fix them. And so I do think we're going to enter a period where integrity and leadership based on integrity is going to become a critical feature of the country, or those who are successful, because the world is becoming more unstable and uncertain.
Thanks, Tim. Can I just say to everybody, we've probably got enough questions. We've got at least another 5 or 6 questions, which we'll try and get through. Time is limited, and I don't want to stretch a friendship with Tim too far. Not that I have a friendship with Tim.
That's right.
The next one is quite an interesting one. As a university student studying nuclear physics, I'm effectively forced to move overseas to gain experience on reactors and power plants. This is the direct effect of the current ban on nuclear power. Can you, Tim, see the benefits to, at the very least, of enabling the nuclear power opportunity to function as part of our national energy grid, promoting further supply to the national energy market, putting pressure on renewables and fossil fuels to depress their prices and undertake more efficient generation methods and meeting our emissions targets?
That's an easy one to answer. Yes. In Parliament, I'm one of the people who is pro-nuclear, quite open about it. There was an excellent report done by one of my colleagues, Ted O'Brien, it must have been about a year ago now, looking at, well, what is the possibility of nuclear power in Australia? And he came to a very sensible proposal, which is there's understandably a lot of anxiety within the community about past nuclear power incidents. And obviously we're talking about Chernobyl and 5 Mile Island. And the point that the outcome of his report was to say, well, we should continue our moratorium on old technology, which I agree with. But it is simply, in my view, insane that a country, obviously with the amount of uranium available to it, with its technological prowess and knowledge and capacity to have high regulatory standards, that we would completely remove an energy source that we know fundamentally delivers low emissions power reliably, particularly if we want to be an industrially successful country. And the most recent energy roadmap the government presented, while it did not endorse nuclear, it kept open the option of nuclear in future years. But the potential that everybody mostly sees is small modular reactors, which are going to come online in the coming years, which both pose a much lower security risk, obviously potential environmental risk, but also in terms of the land and proximity at where they can be located. And particularly where we've already got existing infrastructure in places like Latrobe Valley, that there must be some way where we can address community concern, address regulation while making sure that we have the power the country needs.
Thanks, Tim. This one starts off, congratulations on your book. How do you believe that you'll be able to bring the young, studious, politically aware and free-thinking population along with you? How will we reward the hard workers amongst these taxpayers, amongst this cohort?
Well, I think first and foremost, what we're going to need in the short term is to make sure young Australians have jobs. And you'll see that was a pretty clear focus of the budget last Tuesday, to the extent that there were preferential tax arrangements offered to employ young people, because we're so concerned about young. It's not a 6-month exercise, it's cascading behaviour for many years. And I say this quite candidly in the book, and some people know, and I understand why, will find umbrage in some of my comments in the book, is that I don't believe that there's not anywhere near enough being projected in terms of the political discourse that targets young people. If we go right back to that comment that you made at the start of the quote, which is for people to want to buy into your worldview and to see their interests, you actually have to project a political worldview where they see their lives lived through their values. And the truth is they haven't been a large part of the political discussion. And the practical reality now is whether people like me want it or not, it will happen. The largest voting demographic in Australia today is not baby boomers anymore. It is people between the ages of 18 to 35. That is not a new statistic. In fact, millennials have basically taken over in numerical terms baby boomers back in the 90s. But what they've now, of course, done is reach maturation and become voters. And because of things like the postal survey on marriage for same-sex couples, they're nearly totally enrolled. Where normally there's a lag in enrolment, we actually have nearly a full and complete voting roll for the nation. So I think it ultimately comes down to talking to issues that affect them at their stage of life and addressing their concerns. Yes, a lot of people will focus on things like the environment, and that's important. I'm not arguing it isn't. But actually, what's going to become far more obvious in the coming months and years is that people's time horizons about the things they're concerned about are largely derivative of their position in life. If they're wealthier, they're able to take longer time horizons. If they're poorer, they'll have shorter time horizons. And everybody's time horizons become a lot shorter recently because of the pandemic and the insecurity they're experiencing. Then there's going to move on to jobs. So jobs will be a focus. But then ultimately the critical issue, I think, if you believe in a liberal democracy and the sustaining of a liberal democracy, is you've got to put home ownership at the core of public policy, because it's the basis in which younger people take an investment in the country and therefore have an interest in conserving the existing social, political and economic structures. And other people have made this observation before, but it seems to be something we've completely lost.
Sorry, I just left myself on. Next question. Lionel Shriver wrote a controversial article in the Weekend Australia entitled "Life's a Riot for Children of the Revolution," where he stated, "The surfeit of Western security with no major wars and nearly uninterrupted prosperity for 75 years has resulted in a young cohort not appreciating the fragility of the present order and wishing to destroy the current system. Do you expect to see this attitude to continue, resulting in a revolution, or do you see the answer to the issues that they raise? Or do you see an answer to the issues they raise?"
So I think I think Lionel's analysis is basically right, but it's a direct consequence of the prosperity that they have enjoyed, which has now been disrupted. And so ultimately, it's partly going to be based on how governments respond around the world, including our own, to this crisis, and whether young people see them as being at the centre of the pathway out of the crisis, or whether they feel left behind. Because one of the chief criticisms after the global financial crisis is in a choice between bailing out young people who missed out their jobs versus large banks and corporate entities in the US and the UK, they channeled their energies into the corporate interests. Now, there were arguments about why you should do that and why it delivers this benefit to younger people, but they felt left behind. So I think we're in a really difficult time. I think young people's time horizon is about to become short, and it creates a tinderbox. And I don't mean a tinderbox because I think it's about to explode Bunnings and buy pitchforks, but it will happen through the ballot box, where people will seek out political alternatives that ultimately reflect their ambitions and their concerns. And, I can put partisan labels on that. I'll avoid that because it's Rotary. But, truthfully, the people I think who should be most concerned about that is actually not my party. It's actually the other major political party, because it's going to come through increasingly left-wing political movements, and particularly, I think, a minor party who will channel that rage and that anger and will sell, in my view, policy solutions that won't work, which is me being very polite, but will ultimately lead to the reordering of society.
Thanks for that, Tim. And I might just note on the way through that Rotary is non-party political. It doesn't mean that we don't invite politicians from all political persuasions to participate. And we're delighted that you're here tonight in the same way that earlier one of your federal colleagues, Peter Murphy, came and addressed our club. So we do try and be even-handed there. The next question, what's occurring about the reported halt to some coal mining exports to China, please? And do you think that China or the People's Republic will be listening?
But listening to tonight's conversation,
I don't think we're that paranoid.
All right. Oh, you never know. You never underestimate the extent of surveillance and espionage that the CCP engages in our country and others. But I do agree that it's unlikely they're watching a Rotary meeting, but you never know. They might have paid their $25. So what's the story? I mean, I'm still getting to the bottom of it, is the honest answer about what's actually happening, what the motivation is. What a lot of people are identifying is whether it's the tariffs on barley or wine, or restrictions on the sale of wine, or of course of coal, is that these are absolutely subtle messages from the CCP to a country like ours, that when we stand up for our national interests, that they will seek to punish us. We talked at the start about how there's going to be trade-offs and difficult decisions associated with that. And I think there's a very strong mindfulness in China that they're underwriting a lot of our economic security as a country. It's something we're very conscious of as well, particularly because it means that it puts us in a relative position of strength, and they're occasionally doing things from us. But a lot of these disputes that we're having now have come to the fore of public consciousness, but have actually been going on for a very long period of time. The one around barley has been going on for, I think, about 5 years, if I recall correctly. And so it's just being used as a point of leverage in the current political environment and the relationship between Australia and China. And I suspect we'll continue to see them. So don't be surprised if there's disruptions. Don't be surprised if from time to time we find coal sitting at ports or not being purchased. But that's the price of our sovereignty and our capacity to stand up as a free nation in the rest of the world.
Time is starting to get on, and we've still got a number of questions. We'll try and get through them as quickly as we can. Where does the environment, our environment and diversity, feature in Tim's new social contract?
Well, the environmental stewardship is critical to liberal ideals, because the foundation of the idea of a social contract is taking one generation to the next and moving everybody forward together, and that requires a focus on economic prosperity as great or better than we've inherited, a united society. I make that point critically. You need a united society to move forward together, and of course an environmental stewardship. But I talk about the environment a fair bit in the book, which is that it ultimately comes down to the environment is the foundation of most of our economic prosperity, but there is a legacy effect. Rich countries are in a better position to care for their environment than poor ones. Rich countries are in a better position to undo the damage or the legacy effect of rich countries are in a position to invest in technological solutions which stop other countries, and as we get to environmental challenges, obviously like climate change, which go beyond national borders, to help countries never create as many environmental problems for themselves as they economically develop, and as well as doing it in a competitive way. Because if you want to see people rapacious towards their environment, it's those who depend solely on it for their survival, where they will ultimately destroy any part of it necessary to build up their own lives. So we are actually in an incredibly privileged position to do it, to invest in technology and opportunities to help other countries not go through some of the experiences that we have, to clean up the legacy effect of what has been done. And of course, as people become wealthier, and I said this before, their time horizons go out, they become very more mindful of their overall environmental footprint.
Sorry, just had trouble with getting the sound back on. This one is fairly quick, I think. My nephews and nieces are in their mid-30s and some of them are in their own houses. However, they place more emphasis on issues like climate change, welfare of First Peoples and refugees. They tend to vote either Greens or Labor. Do you think that owning property alone would make them lean towards liberalism?
No, I don't believe it's only about property. It's just the biggest leading indicator, but it's also a reflection on their position of affluence. And I keep going back to that point. Go back to university studies for those who've been there in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. People become more mindful of the world beyond themselves as they go from base levels of security like food and water progressively up and have housing and shelter and a better standard of living. And that's what we've seen over the past 30 odd years is people become richer and richer and richer. They've actually been able to care about things much beyond themselves, which is both positive, which is mostly positive, I need to stress, because people become more mindful of what they can do to help others and their community and the environment. But the trade-off has been that they're perhaps not as mindful of the impact it then has on other people who aren't in that same position. And so I don't want to cast commentary on your nieces and nephews. I think they probably just fit within that time period, and that's the world in which they've grown up with.
Thanks, Tim. Next one, Tim, you mentioned supply chains. The budget has various programs to assist manufacturing. However, it's more of the same with consultant type programs at a time when Australian manufacturers need more customers, not consultants. How can government open up supply chains to Australian manufacturers to provide a pathway for transitioning people from low-paid jobs into more sustainable employment?
So there's so much into that question that we can go through, but obviously it's always been a core focus. Yeah, it's fine. It's been a core focus of government, successive Liberal and Labor, to try and expand Australia's trade interests, and particularly around diversification, to deal with some of those issues around risk in China, because we're all aware of how overdependent we are on one market. But ultimately that requires business to step up. We don't pick where people sell stuff to. We go off and negotiate trade agreements to create pathways. But the truth is there's been too many easy or lazy profits that are made to our north, and that's going to make it more difficult. When it comes to manufacturing, and Australian manufacturing, Australia can never consume its national production. We produce too much, too efficiently, even when we're producing relatively niche quality goods. So it has to be sold off internationally. So that ultimately comes down to, are we competitive? And this is going back to the question around nuclear, around energy. If we do not have a competitive energy system, which is why you've seen a lot of the focus from the Prime Minister on things like gas, then you will not be competitive, because the only other alternative is to reduce our living standards, which is explicitly inverse to the question, what the questioner wants, or energy commodities, labour costs. There's a very limited options we can address, and the other big one is tax. So that's why I think tax reform is critical. Energy investment is critical to make that manufacturing sector more competitive. But we also need to realise that Australia is never going to compete on high volume production of goods. Where we have a competitive advantage is where we complement it with skills and getting that value add extraction, which is a higher premium for higher quality goods in lesser volume. And so that's why there's such a big emphasis in the current budget around skills focus, because that's a big task. You can't turn somebody who makes espressos into an engineer overnight. You've got to get people who obviously have the appetite and the willingness, and that's been a lot of the focus of federal government policy, to encourage people to take up exactly the types of qualifications where there are jobs, but where they compound the benefits of other parts of the economy, so we can be competitive and have those sectors thrive.
Thanks, Tim. This will be the last question. I can just say there's been 2 or 3 questions around concern about democracy, democratic processes and so on. I think some people are a little bit concerned, are we losing our democracy? The question is, it seems identity politics has pushed more people to absolutism in their political beliefs, in that they engage with us or against us. How do we bring people back to the position where reasoned debate can be engaged that challenges people's thinking without further pushing the people to extreme positions?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. If anybody could answer that, I'd love the answer. But So I actually think Australia is much more reasoned than we give it credit for. And we take far too many cues off what is happening in other countries. You know, the United States has a robust individualist culture at the core of their nation and their national identity, which makes it ripe for identity-based politics because people see themselves essentially as, you know, autonomous. Whereas Australians don't, and this, I go through this not explicitly around identity politics, but in the book, around one of the foundations of Australian liberalism has always been its mutualism, this idea that we're codependent, that we have a responsibility not just to ourselves, but to others. And that's the foundation in which we have a united society. And I think the overwhelming number of Australians broadly subscribe to that worldview. But I think one of the problems we're being let down by are a lot of the people in our political culture who, frankly, are lazy, where they import political ideas or political ideologies from overseas that don't really reflect the conditions or the circumstances in Australia because they have nothing else to offer people. And the whole core purpose of writing the book, The New Social Contract, is to say there is a liberal tradition in the classical sense that holds society together, creates the foundation for our national prosperity and national unity, and also provides a pathway for stewardship. But after the 80s, where we focused on neoliberal market economy, there was no thinking about where do we go to next and how do we confront those present challenges that we face today. And this book is the start of a conversation to say, actually, how do we not import bad political ideologies and political agendas from overseas? And how do we focus and build up something that Australians can be for that represents us and makes us distinct? And I think if more politicians grabbed onto, obviously I wish they would agree with the principles behind my book, but the principles behind Australian liberalism, and didn't just look at fighting culture wars from overseas, you would resist and fight that, because extremism leads and compounds to the equal and opposite reaction of more extremism. The more identity-based politics you get on the political left, and that can take on its own force, the more we're seeing it on the right. And we're seeing it not through, we're seeing it through things like religion, where people who claim that they're against identity politics increasingly identify based on their religious faith as the core mobilizing principle of their activity, and that they want it. They want exactly what the left wants, which is, I want legal protection for my religious values that the left want for whatever other social justice objective that they want. And that's not the way forward. It's through rational discussion and understanding our responsibility to each other. And that goes to the heart of the values that I write about, and that which should be taught to kids, should be advocated by our politicians and prosecuted in the public square to deliver public policy that takes society forward together.
Tim, I did say that was the last question. I've just read it's the vagaries and flexibility of new technology. We've had a text message asking if I could ask this question, so this is definitely the last one, I promise. While some people may criticise you, they must agree that you actually believe in something, your ideology, your principles, your policies. Over the last few years, it seems that MPs from both sides, some MPs, not all, from both sides appear to believe in nothing apart from either being in power or aspiring to be in power. As a younger, more recent member of the House of Representatives, have you noticed a more positive change in MPs' convictions, especially among younger parliamentarians?
So I have enormous faith in our democracy, because I see amongst younger MPs a real drive to confront the challenges of the country and to be bold in the way they do it. You know, I'm chair of the Economics Committee, and I'm driving some pretty strong agendas through that. One of my colleagues, Andrew Hastie, the member for Canning, is doing it through another committee of intelligence and security, and we share many similar values and concerns because we're both motivated by ideas. I think one of the most absurd things that we have established in society today is the idea that political ideology is bad. And you hear it all the time, you know, they're ideological. What being ideological means is that you're motivated by ideas And if you're not motivated by ideas, you're motivated by power. So you've got to I think everyone's got to recognise that the strength of political clarity that people can offer, because it gives guidance about how they see the world, what they want to do, and why they want to do it. And I mean, to be frank, I don't much care if people want to criticise me. I think it's quite entertaining. I subscribe to the Churchill factor of you can be judged based on the enemies you accumulate. But I've had people who criticise my book, and truthfully, if I wrote a book that people didn't want to criticise and argue against, firstly, it probably didn't say what needed to be said, and anyone who writes a book that everybody agrees with isn't worth reading.
Tim, that's a great way to finish. Thank you very much. At this stage, it's my great pleasure to call upon Carolyn Such, our fundraising director, who would like to pass a vote of thanks to you. Thank you, Carolyn.
Look, on behalf of the Rotary Club of Mount Eliza and all the friends that have joined us tonight, I want to thank you for your presentation. Judging by the number of questions you've had tonight, people have obviously found the presentation interesting and relevant, and I thank you for that. We know that you're a really busy man, and I thank you for making the time available. And I hope you get lots of good sales for this book. I've got the book. Your mother gave it to me for my birthday. So I haven't read it, but my husband has. He's a much better reader than me. But I promise I'll read it now because I found it fascinating. This has been a really difficult year for us, for everyone, and including the Rotary Club trying to raise money. This webinar has been really successful financially for our club, and I can assure you and everybody listening that the money that we've raised will be used for projects that the Rotary Club support, including local, community and international activities. So it will all go back into the community and be well spent. So once again, I thank you very much. I know you're busy. You probably haven't had dinner, so go off and have a drink for me, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everybody, for attending this evening's webinar. I think it's been most interesting, very wide-ranging, and certainly focused on our future. Tim, we appreciate your support very much. We also appreciate your $25, so thank you for that. Thank you to everybody else who's paid their $25. We've had...
I think I still have to chip it in, but I'll find a way.
We've got between 100 and 200 people, in fact, closer to 200 participating. So it's been a fabulous evening. Thank you, everybody, and bye. Goodbye.